All right, everybody, welcome back to Introduction to U.S. Multicultural Literatures. We are going to have today our final lecture on Nella Larsen's Quicksand, where we will talk about the remainder of the themes of the novel. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear that truck that just passed. We will talk about the remainder of the themes of the novel, and we will talk about, especially about some of the events that happened in the final third or final quarter of the book, since we focused on the earlier parts in the last lecture. So let's actually go back to my slide about setting. So where we left off, Helga had just rejected Axel Olsen's proposal of marriage and left Copenhagen, not only because she had rejected his proposal, but also because she had come to understand the way in which her older relatives in Denmark, the Dahls, essentially wanted to use her as a means of entering a different stratum of society, a more artistic or elite, culturally elite stratum of society, because of the way in which European racism took the form of a kind of exotification of people of color. And so she had recognized this, and it's one of the reasons she leaves Denmark. There are others which we'll want to look at as well. She returns to Haarlem, and she spends a few more chapters in Haarlem, where she again meets her ex-fiance James Vale and comes to see him in a more mature light, though it's just a more mature judgment, I think, a more mature version of the earlier judgment she had formed of him, that he was sort of a sadly provincial person that really couldn't be of interest to her. And then she also re-encounters Dr. Anderson, who had been the leader of the Naxos school, and she had the meeting with him when she left. And there had, throughout that meeting and throughout the book, seemed to be some kind of push pull, some kind of attraction repulsion between them. He had ended up marrying Helga's friend Anne Gray, and yet she shares this kiss with him in Haarlem, and then he says, they agree to meet later, and it seems like she thinks they might develop some kind of romantic relationship, but it turns out he only wanted to meet her to sort of fully break it off between them, and so she slaps him. And this leaves her in very low and despondent spirits, and so she one day is walking along in this low and dejected state, and is battered by a storm, a rainstorm, a thunderstorm, and finds herself in this storefront church led by this charismatic preacher who had come up from the south, and she ends up strangely, kind of obscurely, Helga's motivations are often obscure to herself, undergoing this religious conversion, and she goes back with the Reverend Pleasant Green. She marries this minister and goes back with him to his congregation in Alabama, which she fulfills her usual pattern of, it's very interesting to her, but then it ends up that she is essentially treated by him as a kind of property and a kind of just an instrument to produce his children, and she ends up having a number of children and just despairing that she'll never get out of this place. And the novel ends on a note, I think, of ironic despair. The last line is, she began to have her fifth child, and it sounds like Helga is planning to escape Alabama, but she might not be able to. So what does this all mean? Well, let's go back to where we left off the other day with double consciousness. W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of the essential form of this mentality forced upon African Americans, which is that they were forced to regard themselves as the dominant culture regarded them for their own personal safety, because the United States was a world so controlled by that dominant culture. And I would say that Nella Larsen explores this theme throughout the book. I would like to first look at her attitude toward the Naxos school, because the Naxos school is based on a real institution of learning, the Tuskegee Institute, which was founded by W.E.B. Du Bois's great argumentative opponent, Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was an African American intellectual of the late 19th century, and his argument was that for African Americans to advance, they had essentially to first attain economic status. They had to first seek economic equality with white people. So he founded the Tuskegee Institute precisely to give African American students training in professions and occupations that would allow them to attain this economic equality. And W.E.B. Du Bois was very skeptical of this. W.E.B. Du Bois said, well, he said a couple of things. One of them was that if you neglect the problem of political rights for African Americans, then economic equality won't matter. That, in other words, if the state can legally disenfranchise you, then the state can take your property. And so economic equality without political rights is irrelevant. So that was one critique. I think the critique that is more interesting to Nella Larsen is the idea that this pursuit of economic equality leads to a neglect of cultural particularity, which is to say, if all you're educating African Americans to do is to attain the same economic equality or the same economic living standards as white people, then you're essentially asking them to adopt all the cultural traits of not just white people in general, but a kind of middle class or bourgeois white society. That's what you're asking African Americans to do. And what you're neglecting is what they have to offer culturally. You're neglecting their own particular culture, and you're saying, in saying let's put culture on the back burner, because Booker T. Washington favored a very pragmatic education, one that would very much neglect the arts and humanities in favor of vocational training, or what we might now call STEM training. And Du Bois said if you neglect this cultural dimension, then you're neglecting the cultural advancement of African Americans, which is, number one, good on its own, because every group needs a culture, presumably, but also one of the means with which to secure their political rights, because if your culture is disparaged and you just have to imitate somebody else's culture, then you are also going to be sort of necessarily politically disenfranchised. So that's a very quick sketch of a very complicated subject, the argument between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, but I make it because it's reflected, I think, in the novel. So the portrayal of Naxos in the novel is fairly negative. Helga, it's not, I think it's not just that Helga doesn't like it there. I think it's that Nella Larsen wants us to see that she's right not to like it there. And one of the first things we're told very early in the book is that the school brings in a white preacher and makes all the students and faculty go hear his sermon. And his sermon essentially reproduces racist religious arguments in what I think you can now see as a foreshadowing of the ending of the novel. The preacher talks about how black people have been hewers of wood and drawers of water. And if you read the footnote that's signaled there, footnote 4, or the end note in the Penguin Classics edition, Thaddeus M. Davis, the editor of the novel, explains what he's referring to there is this biblical justification that had been used for slavery. Because in the 19th century, the United States was pretty much a completely Christian nation. And so arguments about other things were made in Christian and biblical terms. And so the arguments between abolitionists and those who defended the institution of slavery both saw themselves as rooted in the Bible and rooted in Christianity. And abolitionists said the Bible and Christianity proclaim equality for all. We're all God's children, and so slavery is wrong. Maybe even from their point of view, racism is wrong. I say maybe even because some of them in the 19th century didn't go so far. Of course, racism is wrong for us. I'm talking in their view, okay? But the defenders of the institution of slavery also drew on Christianity and the Bible, and they drew on this idea that in the Bible there's a story about Noah and how one of his sons saw him naked and cursed him or mocked him, and so his children were forever cursed, the children of Ham. And they identified African Americans as the children of Ham, who were described as hewers of wood and drawers of water. So in other words, they saw racism and slavery as justified based on this biblical story. And the white preacher they bring in at Naxos to speak to the African American students and faculty uses this racist myth in his speech. Okay, so that's one piece of evidence that Naxos is not an institution that Helga sees, or that the novel overall sees, as a sort of responsible steward of the advancement of African Americans. More generally, Helga criticizes it for turning people into types. So she says the school had grown into a machine. It was ruthlessly cutting all to a pattern, the white man's pattern, and it tolerated no innovations, no individualisms. The place was smug and fat with self satisfaction. So, first of all, Larsen and Helga are, I think, satirizing this idea that the way in which African American culture can be advanced in the early 19th century is through imitating this middle class white pattern of kind of bourgeois respectability that comes along with a concern with the economic at the expense of all else, of individualism, of innovation, of beauty. Okay, so that's what Helga calls uplift. This idea of uplifting African Americans through this kind of vocational training and middle class respectability. And this is the first place she leaves behind in the novel. She's seeking something else. And the thing she's seeking, I think, can be differentiated from even a political program, because when she meets Mrs. Hayes Rohr, who is the anti-racist activist that she gets a job with, who brings her to Harlem, she's a little bit, how can I put it? She's a little bit skeptical or just uninterested in Mrs. Hayes Rohr's rhetoric. So she says that, her work was lifted bodily, that is, more or less plagiarized, from previous orations and published works of Wendell Phillips, Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, and other doctors of the race's ills. For variety, Mrs. Hayes Rohr had seasoned hers with a peppery dash of Du Bois and a few vinegary statements of her own. Aside from these, it was, Helga reflected, the same old thing. So what I think Helga is skeptical not only of the Booker T. Washington view of uplift, but also a version of uplift that, while it may be more radical than that, stays at the level of the political, of the rhetorical. I think one of the things that marks this as a novel of the modernist moment is that she's interested in something we might call cultural, as separated from the directly political. Okay, so let's look at some passages there. So these two passages, I think, contrast with each other. So let's read them from the bottom up. When Helga is at Naxos, one of the reasons she doesn't fit in is because she comes from this obscure origin. So her mother was white, and her mother, it seems, was more or less of the working class or relatively poor, and she's coming from the north, and she's coming into this southern institution where many of the students and faculty belong to a black middle class, a black bourgeoisie that had existed for a long time. And so she's coming into this atmosphere, and they don't quite know how to receive her. They don't quite know how to take her, because they're used to people where you can trace their family connections and you can trace their lineage. So she's coming into this black bourgeoisie as an outsider. Her own lack of family, it says, disconcerted them. No family. That was the crux of the whole matter. And then skipping a few sentences, Negro society, she had learned, was as complicated and as rigid in its ramifications as the highest strata of white society. So this is what she's against at Naxos, this idea of living in a rigidly stratified society, not only by race, but then within the stratified racial groups, there's these stratifications of class and of lineage. And she's against that. And she especially doesn't think that African Americans should imitate this feature of the white world that is, in her view, bad that is repressive. What does she see instead? Or what does she want instead? Well, she never fully articulates it. Helga never kind of comes out with a 10-point philosophy that would show us what she believes is an alternative to what she criticizes, but we get hints. And one of them, it comes back to that idea we talked about the other day of clothing, of fashion and ornament, where one of the things that she didn't like at Naxos was that they made everybody wear very plain, drab clothes as part of this pursuit of middle-class bourgeois respectability. And one of the things they judged Helga for is she liked bright-colored clothes. And she said, in her view, dark-complexioned people should wear yellow, green, and red. Black, brown, and gray were ruinous to them, actually destroyed the luminous tones lurking in their dusty skins. Again, look how deeply Helga thinks about fashion. For her, it's a full, rich part of art and of culture and of self-expression. So one of the loveliest sights Helga had ever seen, it says, had been a sooty black girl decked out in a flaming orange dress, which a horrified matron had next day consigned to the dyer, presumably to remove that bright color. Why, she wondered, didn't someone write a plea for color? These people yapped loudly of race consciousness, of race pride, and yet suppressed its most delightful manifestations: love of color, joy of rhythmic motion, naive, spontaneous laughter. So in Helga's view, the thing to pursue is not economic advancement for its own sake, and not even political rhetoric or political change for its own sake, but the legitimation of particular qualities and particular beautiful aspects of black culture. So this is a novel that speaks up for culture as central and important, and culture in that sense of the practices, the characteristic practices of a group of people. All right, so this is something to keep in mind. This is a novel that makes a plea for culture, if I can borrow Helga's phrase. We're going to read other stuff later in the semester that's going to be very skeptical of this idea of culture, that's going to say, no, that's not the way to go. So I want you to keep that in mind. But for this book, let's focus on this book. This book is arguing on behalf of that idea of culture, of cultural redemption and cultural emancipation. There is, however, a barrier to this advancement of African American culture in the book, and here I think is where double consciousness comes in. There are two scenes in the novel that I think show Helga's double consciousness. And remember, one of the things double consciousness is a kind of internalized racism, because in Du Bois's argument, African Americans have to see themselves as the white dominant culture sees them, so they can be secure in their knowledge of how society is organized, because being oppressed by that society, it's necessary that they have that knowledge. But this creates a kind of inner pain, because essentially you're seeing yourself through the eyes of someone that disparages you, that oppresses you, that thinks you are lesser as a person. And you're internalizing the stereotypes, the tropes, the images, the racism that dominant culture bears. And I think we see that in two moments in the novel. In one is the scene when Helga is first in Harlem and she goes to the jazz club and she's listening to jazz, which was, a form of music that would at the time have been considered a characteristic form of African American cultural expression. And she says she has a very intense response to the music. She was drugged, lifted, sustained by the extraordinary music, blown out, ripped out, beaten out by the joyous, wild, murky orchestra. The essence of life seemed bodily motion. And when suddenly the music died, she dragged herself back to the present with a conscious effort and a shameful certainty that not only had she been in the jungle, but that she had enjoyed it, began to taunt her. She hardened her determination to get away. She wasn't, she told herself, a jungle creature. So I think what's extraordinary about this passage is the kind of shift in tone. So remember, I said Helga was an aesthete. She's interested in the aesthetic, in artistic sensations and perceptions for their own sake. And her aestheticism is very richly rewarded by the intensity of this music, the sublime experience she has while listening to it, where the essence of life seemed bodily motion. So you might expect Helga to become a great champion of jazz, in line with her earlier view that we read on the last slide about making a plea for color. She wants this kind of cultural advancement of the African American community. And yet, something stops her, because what intrudes here, this image of the jungle, that is a racist idea. Okay, that's basically just a racist concept that the white dominant culture had about African American culture, this idea of coming from the jungle. And in this moment, Helga kind of catches herself and stops her aesthetic rapture. And she stops it because she is stopped by this racist image of herself as a jungle creature. And she wants to distance herself from that. She wants to say, that's not me. So she draws back from African American culture in its manifestation as jazz, even though she clearly finds it beautiful, sublime, enriching, and extraordinary art. And I think this is a passage where we see double consciousness in the novel. Similarly, well, it's similar but different. Something happens to her in Copenhagen, which is where she's in a theater and she's watching the performances, and she sees, so I'm reading from the slide on the right. They were reaching for their wraps when out upon the stage pranced two black men, American Negroes undoubtedly, for as they danced and cavorted, they sang in the English of America an old ragtime song that Helga remembered hearing as a child, "Everybody Gives Me Good Advice." At its conclusion, the audience applauded with delight. Only Helga Crane was silent, motionless. Now, this is slightly different from jazz because we're not given a lot of detail here, but I think what's happening, and I think the way that critics have interpreted this scene, is that what she's seeing is something that's like the minstrel show, which was a kind of stereotyped performance of African American culture that was popular in America in the late 19th and early 20th century, that was often performed by white performers in blackface, though sometimes it was also performed by black performers. However, whoever was performing it, the point of the minstrel show was to create this kind of comic performance of African American culture for white audiences. And when Helga sees this in Europe, I think it helps her to understand the way she's being treated by her white audience, so to speak, in Europe. That she's being commodified and her culture is being caricatured for this white audience that just wants to use her as what she calls a curio, a peacock, an ornament. So again, I think that's a moment of double consciousness, but I don't want to get too complicated, but I think it's actually a moment of what we might call triple consciousness, which is to say that Helga, if in the earlier passage this white racist ideology entered her mind and stopped her from enjoying the music, here I think she now understands the way that racist ideology is conditioning the reception of black culture among white audiences, and she doesn't want any part of it. So now she's aware of her double consciousness, which I think makes her triply conscious or something. We don't need numbers, but the point is she's now aware of, I think, precisely the logic of what had happened to her in the jazz club, which is that there's these racist ideas that structure, that inform, and that determine how white audiences, or even African American audiences that have internalized white standards, receive and understand African American cultural expression. Okay. That brings us to another piece of cultural context I want to add to the novel. It's something that often comes up in criticism of the novel, and Thaddeus Davis discusses it in her introduction to the book, to the Penguin Classics edition. So there's this stereotype or trope that comes out of the 19th century called the tragic mulatto myth. So mulatto is an archaic and I think now offensive term referring to people of mixed white and black race, mixed black and white ancestry. And the tragic mulatto myth was created, we can actually date it very particularly to a short story by a white abolitionist writer named Lydia Maria Child. And she wrote a story called The Quadroons. Quadroon is yet another archaic and now offensive term for people of mixed black and white heritage. And in The Quadroons, the point of the story is an enslaved African American woman kind of escapes slavery and then marries somebody and then has a child, and they live in sort of beauty and luxury, but then the child is taken back into slavery because she's understood to be African American. And so this sets up the idea that being of mixed ancestry is always tragic in America. And Lydia Maria Child, again, she was an abolitionist, so she was writing the story to emphasize the injustice of this tragedy, but it becomes this stereotype with a life of its own in the work of white and African American artists and writers. And as far as Thaddeus Davis tells it in her introduction to the Penguin Classics edition, and she quotes Alan Locke, who reviewed this novel, who was the promoter of the Harlem Renaissance, what Nella Larsen does to innovate on this myth, what she does to turn it into something more complicated than it had been before, is she shows that it's not really a story of heredity. It's not really a biological story about race anymore. She transforms the understanding of what race is into a matter not of biology but of culture. And so the division in Helga Crane is not the way the 19th century with its biological racism would have seen it, as a conflict between two kinds of blood. They had these almost I don't know how to describe it, these almost mystical biological concepts that different kinds, if you had white blood, this meant one thing. If you had black blood, it meant this other thing. Nella Larsen gets rid of that, and what she brings into the discussion, how she innovates on and subverts this stereotype, is that really what Helga is torn between is two different visions of culture, not two different races in some biological essentialist sense. Okay, and that, I think, comes out in, so the novel is ambivalent, or Helga is ambivalent about whether the mixing of the races, to put it in the terms that are used in the book, is a good thing. She often seems to be somewhat against it. And look at the middle passage on the left here. She's telling her hosts in Denmark, she responded, believe in mixed marriages between races, They brought only trouble to the children, as she herself knew too well from bitter experience. So, and when she's thinking about her mother, she thinks of her mother, a fair Scandinavian girl in love with life, with love, with passion, dreaming and risking all in one blind surrender, a cruel sacrifice. So why does she think it's cruel? Why doesn't she believe in mixed marriages? Well, one of the reasons is because her experience is that everywhere she goes, people want to reject her because of this mixed heritage. We saw that with Uncle Peter's new wife, who just rejects her and kind of pretends, she says something like, you're not really his niece, because the white world doesn't want a part of her in this very racist period. But when in the African American community, she runs into problems as well. So for instance, Mrs. Hayes Rohr says to her, And by the way, I wouldn't mention that my people are white if I were you. Colored people won't understand it, and after all, it's your own business. When you've lived as long as I have, you'll know that what others don't know can't hurt you. So she's regarded, excuse me, with a kind of suspicion or rejection in both white culture and African American culture, because this theme, this idea of being mixed race, seems to be troubling to both of those communities. So that puts her in a difficult position. And I think that's why she comes out with this rhetoric against the idea of mixed marriages, of mixed child rearing. However, for her, again, I just want to say what Thaddeus Davis said on the previous slide. For her, it's never quite a matter of biological race being the problem. What it is a matter of cultural allegiance. So I want to look at the passage, so this is the one on the right, where she decides to leave Copenhagen. And she says, "I'm homesick not for America, but for Negroes. That's the trouble." For the first time, Helga Crane felt sympathy rather than contempt and hatred for that father who so often and so angrily she had blamed for his desertion of her mother. She understood now his rejection, his repudiation of the formal calm her mother had represented. She understood his yearning, his intolerable need for the inexhaustible humor and the incessant hope of his own kind, his need for those things, not material, indigenous to all Negro environments. She understood and could sympathize with his facile surrender to the irresistible ties of race now that they dragged at her own heart. So let's look at this passage. What she sympathizes now with her father for leaving her mother. Why? Because as she now wants to leave this entirely, what she's experiencing is the entirely white world of Europe, the thing she feels is a nostalgia for African American culture. And what she feels is a desire to repudiate white culture, which she represents as formal calm. So the idea is that white culture has this kind of formality, this placidity, this respectability that she sees as contrasting with the greater cultural vibrancy of African American life. So, but note, these ties are not material. They're not biological. They're nothing like that. They're cultural. They're a desire to live in one culture rather than another. By the way, if you read this passage closely, you'll see that Helga, even here, is a little ambivalent. She describes her father's surrender to this nostalgia as facile, which is a word that means easy or simple, but it usually has a pretty negative connotation, as in too easy, too simple. He had sort of given in too easy. And, she describes African Americans as his own kind, not her own kind. So even in this passage, Helga is ambivalent. Helga always has mixed feelings. She can never fully rest in any one position. But still, I think this idea of being drawn to culture rather than to any mystically biological sense of the ties of race is where Larsen subverts this stereotype of the tragic mulatto. This passage also brings us into, I mentioned Nella Larsen being influenced by 19th century and early 20th century novels by white writers that focused on the differences between America and Europe. And I think that this novel rewrites that theme from an African American perspective. And I think what Helga undergoes is, it's not that she changes her mind about what it's like to be African American in Europe, it's that she changes how she feels about it as she experiences more of it. And what she experiences is, at first she likes the way that European culture kind of embraces the difference between black and white people. She said, hitherto, all her efforts had been towards similarity to those about her. But in Europe, she's encouraged to emphasize her racial and cultural difference. And she sees this as kind of as refreshing, especially coming from a place like Naxos, where there's all this effort toward assimilation into a uniform, respectable middle class ideal. However, the problem is that it makes her, in their eyes, always the other, always something exotic for them to appreciate as spectators. She can never sort of fit in there. Not fit in the sense of assimilation culturally, but she can never just be a person. There's always this screen of otherness. However, the attraction Europe holds over America is that in Europe itself, so I don't want you to get the wrong idea from this book. It's not that there's not racism in Europe, but what there was not in European countries like Denmark was there wasn't anything equivalent to the Jim Crow laws that existed in America. There wasn't this formal legal segregation and this semi-legalized terror of lynching and things like that that existed in the United States. So there was much more freedom of movement for African Americans in Europe, and that's why so many great black writers went to Europe in the 20th century, whether Richard Wright or James Baldwin, following in later generations in the footsteps of Nella Larsen. So that's why she describes it as physical freedom in Europe on the last slide on the right there. She says in Europe there is physical freedom because you don't have to ride in a different train car, and there's not the Ku Klux Klan, and there's not lynching, and so there's freedom of movement. But in America there's spiritual freedom. And where does she find spiritual freedom? What does she mean by that? She finds it because of her feeling at home in African American culture, which does not exist in the same way in Europe. So that's Nella Larsen's take on the America versus Europe question that obsessed so many important European American writers of her time, such as Henry James or Edith Wharton. All right, now we need to start thinking about the way that race affects Helga's experience specifically as a woman, her experience specifically of gender. And I think the chief way it does so is how black women are racialized and sexualized. There's this idea, and she encounters it over and over again in Europe, and particularly in the very crude kind of attention that Axel Olsen pays to her, which is that because she's not white, Axel Olsen and other white individuals don't consider her fully respectable. And so they in their view, that gives them a freedom to sexualize her that they wouldn't feel if dealing with a white woman. And so Helga always is conscious of this. She says, she had a stripped naked feeling under his glance. And he's painting her portrait, and when he paints her, she describes his painting as representing some disgusting sensual creature with her features. And even I think her maid says, it looks bad, wicked. She's sexualized not only because Axel Olsen is a sexist, but because his sexism is mixed with a form of racism that for him gives him the sense that he's entitled to sexualize a black woman in a way that he wouldn't do so to a white woman. And this comes out most clearly in his terrible insult to her, where he says, you have the warm, impulsive nature of the women of Africa, but my lovely, you have, I fear, the soul of a prostitute. And this comes just before her, as you can see from what he said to her, entirely justified violent rejection of his proposal, because she is sexualized in this way. So that's the way I think that Nella Larsen represents race and gender as intersecting in the book. I think she also represents gender as its own vector and its own form of oppression, even in a way irrespective of race. And what I mean by that is everywhere Helga goes, whether it is the sort of black bourgeoisie of the South at Naxos, the cultured sort of artistic bourgeoisie of Harlem, or the white world of Copenhagen, it doesn't matter where she goes. Everywhere she goes, everyone expects that a young woman should get married and start having kids. So there's no place, whether irrespective of class or race, whether it's poor or rich or black or white, all of those societies assume that a young woman's got to get married to a man and have some kids. And Helga is never quite fully invested in that. So when she describes her mother's experiences, she describes her as having to get married to her stepfather, and she seems to particularly dislike her stepfather. But she says the reason her mother had to marry her stepfather is because even foolish, despised women must have food and clothing. So, and again, this is where we see that it doesn't really matter about race. Even whether you're a white woman or a black woman, you're expected to get married. And if you're not married, you're limited. It's not just an ideological thing. This was still a world in which women couldn't receive certain kinds of educations, couldn't hold certain kinds of jobs, and so couldn't necessarily expect to be economically independent. So they depended economically on marrying a man who had access to other money-making professions so he could support her and their children. So, and this is something that Helga faces throughout the book. She struggles with money. And when she rejects Axel Olsen, the people around her are like, why would you reject this good marriage from the perspective of economics? So she's always expected to get married, even though she doesn't want to. She doesn't want to have children. Part of that is her acute sense of the oppression of African Americans, that she thinks there's a certain cruelty in bringing more people into the world to be oppressed. And whether we think that's reasonable or understandable or not, still the point is she doesn't want to get married and have children necessarily. And even when she seems to maybe want to, there does seem to be a genuine attraction on her part toward Dr. Anderson throughout the novel. It's still, when she's thinking of him in the last passage on this slide, the thought of love stayed with her, not prominent, definite, but shadowy, incoherent. So it's never something she fully formulates to herself. It's not something she fully thinks about or something she fully focuses on. And yet, it's what society expects of her as a woman. This brings us to the end of the novel and to the final theme I want to discuss, which is religion. So this book, should I say this way? This book is full of very nuanced views of gender and race. I think its view of religion is a lot more straightforward, and it's very negative. This book takes a very dim view of religion. I think that it takes a view that religion is simply a kind of alibi of oppression and its own form of oppression, particularly for both black people and women, and black women most especially. So, and if this isn't your view, don't worry, we're going to read a lot of books over the course of the semester. In fact, the next novel we're reading takes a much more positive view of religion, so we will encounter a diversity of opinions on this subject in the course. But for this book, religion is portrayed fairly negatively. So Helga was not religious we're told at the beginning of the book she's not religious. She took nothing on trust. She was not a person who is very into faith. What she loves as an aesthete are the things of this world, the beautiful things of the secular world. However, by the end of the book, she's been totally defeated, I think, is the way she feels by her experiences. She feels that she's never going to find a place for herself. She's never going to find a form of love she can really treasure. And she's very young. She's in her mid-20s, and she feels that her life is sort of already over. And that's at her most vulnerable. That's when she goes into it's not a church, it's a kind of storefront revivalist meeting. And she goes in here, and at first she's enjoying it because she's experiencing it aesthetically. She's, the singing, the dancing, it's interesting, it's intense, it's something she's not used to, it's something she hasn't seen before. She first meets it on that aesthetic ground, but she finds herself more and more drawn into it. So look at the passage at the bottom left. Fascinated, now that's an aesthetic emotion. She's interested. Her senses are aroused. Her eye is pleased. Fascinated, Helga Crane watched until there crept upon her an indistinct horror of an unknown world. She felt herself in the presence of a nameless people, observing rites of a remote, obscure origin. Then later on, go up to the top right. From those about her came a thunderclap of joy. Arms were stretched toward her with savage frenzy. The women dragged themselves upon their knees or crawled over the floor like reptiles, sobbing and pulling their hair and tearing off their clothing. So she experiences this. It reminds me of the passage on jazz when she's in the jazz club. She experiences this sublime frenzy. But here, this notion that it's savage, that it's irrational, that it's animalistic doesn't sort of bother her. It draws her in more fully. It doesn't stop her. She surrenders to this feeling. Okay? And in one way we might think that's progress over the scene in the jazz club, because she's not kind of checked by this internalized racism. But I think the difference is, and I think the difference for Nella Larsen is that jazz and other forms of artistic expression she sees as beneficial, and there's no reason to have any negative reaction toward them. But this, I think, Nella Larsen sees as potentially dangerous. So this might have been a moment where, not that Helga should have capitulated to internalized racism, but that she should have seen the scene more clearly. Why does Helga surrender to this? Well, let's just go on in that passage on the top right. A miraculous calm came upon her. Life seemed to expand and to become very easy. Helga Crane felt within her a supreme aspiration toward the regaining of simple happiness, a happiness unburdened by the complexities of life, of the lives she had known. And then just read down on the next passage 2 pages later. Because she thought, all I've ever had in life has been things, except just this one time. Things, she realized, weren't enough for her. So her experience of religion offers her something beyond things. I would argue she was always interested in something beyond things, which was not the things themselves, but the beauty and the richness of life that the things gave her access to. But at this point in the novel, she doesn't see that. And why doesn't she see that? Because she's seeking simplicity. She's seeking simple happiness, whereas everything she's experienced throughout this very complex novel has been very complex. Now, I think from Nella Larsen's perspective, or let's talk about the perspective of the novel, the perspective the novel overall asks us to take, we're supposed to see this as a kind of tragic fall. It's a tragic fall for a character who was able to live with complexity and is now not, and kind of gives in to simplicity. Why does Nella Larsen portray religion as being simplistic? Well, for one thing, there's the social setting she gives it. Religion hadn't been incredibly important in any of the middle class social surroundings the novel has shown us so far. At Naxos, it just kind of went along with middle class respectability. In Harlem, the people who lived in Harlem were kind of cultural sophisticates, post-Darwinian, post-Freudian, and probably weren't very religious. And same thing in Copenhagen, really. So this was something that was more, in a way, about class than race. Wherever she went, religion wasn't very important. When she goes to Alabama and goes to a setting where religion is important, what she finds is she stepped down in class, and she's living in a lower class world where religion seems to be a means of social control, and particularly patriarchal control. So this man, the Reverend Pleasant Green, he's married to her, but he also seems, this is hinted in the novel without being directly stated, it seems like all the other women of the congregation he also treats as belonging to him. So it's this very brutal form of social control in cultural settings where there's nothing to compete with it that would, in Helga's or Nella Larsen's view, be more sophisticated. And this is nowhere more satirically shown than in the fact that the church they go to had once been a stable and still smells of horse manure. So that is what Nella Larsen, I think, thinks of religion. And Helga begins to be aware that her adoption of religious faith is for a bad reason. It says, her religion was to her a kind of protective coloring shielding her from the cruel light of an unbearable reality. So she's just adopted it defensively. It doesn't actually mean anything to her. And soon enough, as she goes on, to the point of being treated as this reverend's property and his means of reproducing, to the point where she's almost dying from pregnancy, she rejects religion. And she rejects it in racial terms. She sees Christianity as a white imposition on African Americans, the white man's God, she says. Helga thinks, how could 10 million black folk credit it when daily before their eyes was enacted its contradiction? And then over a couple pages later, religion had, after all, its uses, she says ironically, because she thinks they're bad uses. It blunted the perceptions, so it makes you insensitive to the things around you because you're just focused on the spiritual. In that sense, it's the anti-aesthetic. It blunted the perceptions, robbed life of its crudest truths, especially it had its uses for the poor and the blacks. For the blacks, the Negroes. And this, Helga decided, was what ailed the whole Negro race in America, this fatuous, which is to say stupid, belief in the white man's God, this childlike trust in full compensation for all woes and privations, which means losses, in kingdom come. So she takes on a view, it's actually very close to Karl Marx. Karl Marx famously said religion is the opiate of the people, by which he meant that it was a kind of painkiller distributed by the upper classes to the lower classes to console them for their exploitation and make them not realize the ways in which they are being exploited. And Helga Crane comes to the same view, that religion is a tool of social control used against poor people, black people, and women, and, most of all, poor black women. And so she rejects religion in that way. And that rejection of religion really is where is the last sort of thematic statement of the novel. And I think it's thematically important because what Nella Larsen represents as the religious sensibility is the opposite of the sensibility that governs the novel. The sensibility that governs the novel is all about subtle perception, telling the truth, seeing the complexities of real life situations. And so in that sense, Quicksand is a novel that is not part in any way of a religious sensibility, at least given how Nella Larsen defines the religious sensibility. Again, I assure you, we will read works later in the semester, and very soon, in fact, that have a much more positive definition of the religious sensibility. So that brings us to, I think, the end of talking about Quicksand. I want to say a few more things. I want to note, number one, that this book is very concerned, and I think this makes it very much part of the modernist movement, with the unconscious mind and unconscious feeling. Throughout the novel, Helga feels things before she understands them, and acts on things before she understands them. And Nella Larsen is very interested in charting the way that unconscious feelings and desires come into activity and into consciousness. Sometimes it's very funny. This is, I think, I've neglected this aspect of the book, but I think this is a very funny book. It's a kind of social satire. So at Helga's meeting with Dr. Anderson, the narrator tells us, in the girl blazed a desire to wound. So sorry if the motorcycle just passed, maybe you didn't hear that. In the girl blazed a desire to wound. There he sat, staring dreamily out the window, blatantly unconcerned with her or her answer. Well, she'd tell him. She pronounced each word with deliberate slowness. Well, for one thing, I hate hypocrisy. I hate cruelty to students. So let's just stop there for a minute. This is where I think there's a little bit of a comedy of the unconscious. In the girl blazed a desire to wound. 4 lines later, I hate cruelty. Now, if you feel a desire to wound, you might not hate cruelty as much as you think you do. And I think what's going on in this passage is Nella Larsen is showing, with a very keen modernist kind of Freudian interest in the unconscious, how what we think we're doing and what we tell ourselves we're doing is very different from how we're not letting ourselves know we're feeling. And I think that happens throughout the book, this mismatch between the face Helga puts on, the story she tells the world about herself, and what's actually going on in the depths. And we see this too in the moment where she slaps Dr. Anderson. A sort of madness had swept over her. She felt that he had belittled and ridiculed her, and thinking this, she had suddenly savagely slapped Robert Anderson with all her might in the face. And that word savage was also used in the church when she experiences the revival meeting. The people move toward her with savage frenzy, and I believe it was also used, or at least words with a similar connotation were used, like wild, for instance, when she's in the jazz club. So this idea of wildness, of savagery, I think what Nella Larsen is doing is she's disconnecting that idea from its racist tropes that Helga has internalized, and really saying it's universal, that we all have these wild impulses in our unconscious that come out in ways we can't predict or expect. Okay, so that interest in the unconscious is something I want to flag. And I think also you might remember I said that W.E.B. Du Bois described this novel as courageous, and I do think there's a kind of bravery to this novel. And one of the things I think is very brave about it is its refusal to not, that's a double negative, it's, let me put it this way, its willingness to stay with negative emotion. This is not a book that kind of sugarcoats the world. It shows, it dwells on, it captures this kind of negativity that Helga seems always to feel. She's very, that's the other side of aestheticism, by the way. She's very sensitive to beauty, and she's very sensitive to ugliness. So I think of the moment when she's in the train, and she says, she's thinking, the smell of stale food and ancient tobacco irritated Helga like a physical pain. So she feels negative things very, very strongly. And so much so, I think that's part of her double consciousness. And the passage on the top right, she understands and sympathizes with her white relative's racism. She understood and sympathized with Mrs. Nilsson's point of view, as always she had been able to understand her mother's, her stepfather's, and his children's points of view. She saw herself for an obscene sore in all their lives. So she's so sensitive to negative emotion that she even adopts it against herself. I think it's one of the things that allows her to have as kind of immobilizing a case of double consciousness as she does. And we're told flat out on page 37, this is the last passage on the slide, for all the it's described as the self-sufficient, uninterested manner she adopted instinctively as a protective measure for her acute sensitiveness in her child days still clung to her. So this is a character whose defining trait is she's so incredibly overly sensitive that she has to build a kind of wall to keep the world out. And both of those things, the oversensitivity and the protectiveness of it, are why she can't stay anywhere, are why she can't be at home anywhere. Because everywhere she's super sensitive to what's wrong with the place she is, and then that wall goes up and she has to flee. But because she's so sensitive, she would sort of feel that anywhere, despite the fact that she ends up in the worst place she's ever been, which is this almost captivity in Alabama. Nevertheless, she never would have fully felt at home anywhere because of this acute sensitivity, not only to beauty and the arts and the aesthetic, but to negativity, to ugliness, to obscenity. And that, I think, brings us to our final thoughts on the book. It's a very pessimistic book, ultimately, at least as far as, it's a character study of this one character, and it's very pessimistic about her chances. It seems like the book ends with her dreaming of escape. It was so I'm looking at the last page. It was so easy and so pleasant to think about freedom in cities, about books and clothes, about the sweet mingled smell of aubergine and cigarettes in softly lighted rooms filled with inconsequential chatter and laughter and sophisticated tuneless music. So she's dreaming about leaving. But reality is, and this is the last sentence of the novel, and hardly had she left her bed and become able to walk again without pain, hardly had the children returned from the homes of the neighbors, when she began to have her fifth child. And I think that means she's not going to get out of there. And it sounds, given the health crisis she's just went through with her last pregnancy, it sounds like she might die. It sounds like she might be doomed. So in that sense, it's a very pessimistic novel about the chances that this woman can find freedom. But I would like to argue that it's not simply pessimistic. So I want to give you one more genre term for this book. We talked about it being a Bildungsroman, and now we can see it's a failed Bildungsroman. Our young protagonist has not found her place in the world, so it's a failed Bildungsroman. We talked about it as a novel of manners, a social novel. We talked about it as a novel of the inner life of modernist consciousness. I want to give an older term to this, though, and I'm sure it's one you know from your high school education. I think this book is a tragedy. And what a tragedy is it's the story of a person who has some kind of nobility of character, but has a flaw within them that leads to their downfall. And the important thing about tragedy is it's not just a sad or negative story. It's a story that's oddly, it's hard to explain. Many people have tried. There's an odd kind of positive quality to it because you don't only experience the tragic hero or heroine's fall, you also enjoy the nobility, even the flawed nobility that made that fall possible. And I think Helga's flaw, we just discussed it, is her acute supersensitivity, her aestheticism in both positive ways, her sensitivity to beauty, and negative ways, her sensitivity to ugliness. That's a flaw because it means she can never be at home anywhere. But that's a noble flaw. Because what it is it means, yeah, she can never be at home anywhere, but she's always searching. She's always seeking her freedom, her place, where she belongs. We might say it's a fault, but there's a gloriousness to that fault. There's a splendor, a sublimity to that fault. And that, I think, makes Helga not merely a sad case, not merely a pathetic character, but a grand character, a tragic heroine. And so I want to not end my lecture with the last page of the book because the last page is so negative. Let's leave Helga at her best point, at her highest point. I think her finest moment in the novel is her rejection of Olsen's proposal. But you see, Herr Olsen, I'm not for sale. Not to you, not to any white man. I don't at all care to be owned, even by you. And so the end of the novel shows us her tragedy. I think that passage shows us her heroism. This is a tragic heroism. This is a tragic heroine. And this novel is a Bildungsroman, is a novel of manners, is a modernist novel of consciousness, but is also a great modern tragedy. And so there I will leave you. That's our last lecture on Quicksand, and that's our last lecture on modernism. And so we'll be turning to a new sort of period. We're going to be transitioning into the mid 20th century in our next studies there, and so you'll want to begin reading what's on the syllabus for that. However, the next lecture that I give will be about essay writing, because now that we've completed our first novel and read our first group of poems and completed our first unit, I think now it's time that we can fully begin to think about the essays you have to write for this course. So my next lecture will be about essay writing, and then the one after that I will begin our new unit on realism ideology, the mid 20th century, and it will be about the poems that are assigned for that unit. All right, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this. If not, that's fine too. And have a great day.